It was very sad for me putting a title to this talk that would deal with bridging the divide, because it's the sort of title we were coming up with in the late 80s and early 90s when we were debating this extraordinary proposition of the post-apartheid city and what were the criticalities for change. And it's terribly sad to say we are still putting the same title to the same thoughts now, because nothing has changed. There has been very little by way of transformation. In many respects, in fact, research in the Gauteng city region, which I'll be talking about today, has got worse. And so what are we going to do to work urban structure towards change? Probably one of the quickest ways to get the good people of Johannesburg to wet their pants in fright is to use the term urbanism and Africa in the same place. It's a bit like putting sex and guilt together. Can you ever imagine what a mess it would be if we got sex and guilt mixed up together? And so we have this issue of making sustainable cities. Of course we all want to make sustainable cities. We are talking about mega cities, and probably one of the most fundamental dimensions of that sustainability, of course it's about all the good things, but if we can't find a social and political inclusionism in all of that, we don't have a sustainable system. Bearing in mind, we're talking about a mega city, which doesn't mean it's just a groot city. It's a particularly underdeveloped region kind of idea. So where a huge number of people come to a city with perceived hope. And so if we look at the eastern seaboard or the western seaboard of the States, you'll see that there are many cities, not really big cities, they're in the order of 8 to 10 million, 12 million people, but there are many of them closer together because they're supported by a hinterland of relative wealth, a concentration of people who can support that many urban centers in one place. If we look at Europe, and Western Europe particularly, we see much the same kind of thing. A lot of biggish cities supported by relative wealth. When we go, and Sao Paulo is of course probably the leader in all of these mega cities, we're looking at really big hinterlands of dire need where the opportunity is seen in one urban center, whether it's Sao Paulo or Mexico City. We see the same with Jakarta, Manila, Mumbai, Kolkata. And obviously in Africa, we see Cairo, we see Lagos, we see the Gauteng city region. To a lesser extent, and they're probably not the right fundamentals there, we see Nairobi to a certain extent as well. But we're talking about cities that get to 30 million people with a vast disparity of wealth. Very few people having a lot, and a hell of a lot of people having very little. But all trying to find it, and that's the genius of cities, is their ability to take people and allow them to find themselves in that place. And urbanization is actually one of our greatest causes for optimism. And so the brief for redefining an urban structure of transformation for the Gauteng city region was a fantastic one. It was design a city structure that is robust enough to cope with 30 million people over the next 40 years. Later this afternoon, we'll solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And so we really set about this thing very, very determinedly. I've always hated this level of planning because it happens at that motherhood and apple pie level. Say we want a sustainable city. Well, you'd have to be brain dead not to want a sustainable city. What does it mean on the ground? How do you take these high-level policies and drill them down? And through some extraordinary people that I had handpicked onto this team, I found there's a vast amount of artificial intelligence in GIS that we were able to tap into and model. I'm not going to go into that too much today, but fantastically, it's allowed us to get to, that's the closest you'll ever get to a single picture of this idea of how we're going to recompact and recomplexify the city around a reinvented structure. Because every time you call that picture up, it's reinvented straight out of the GIS with the most relevant and recent information. So it's never a static drawing. But it all works on this principle that historically, if you look at metropolitan planning worldwide, cities are patterned about overcoming distance. And so you had Johannesburg, the old PWV thing, Pretoria, Vanderbijl Park. You had a bit of a rail system, the east-west one working very well. The one that went from Johannesburg via Germiston, Kempton Park, Pretoria, not so great because Paul wouldn't allow it to come straight to Pretoria from Joburg because of the 8-lander problem. The trouble with urban transport is the general rule is you should be able to get to work roughly on the day you left for work. And so that doesn't work too well, and that's in fact why Gautrain has come into the picture. But what did happen was all of these things kind of look like an urban sneeze, are actually driven by urban fundamentals. They're there because economically they need to be there and they're doing an urban job. Historically, that's how it was. It formed into this very nice, powerful kind of cruciform pattern. And it was only later, with Grand Apartheid, you got this kind of club-footed hunchback that got onto the stage and started doing a parody of Dame Margot Fontein. And so you got displacement of poor people to the perimeter. And that's where everything goes pear-shaped, and that's what gives us the greatest cause for concern, is how do you recreate a city that brings those people into the system? They were put there against their will. They've, through a culture of poverty, had to learn how to cope in that culture of poverty. They can't move, and the city isn't incorporating them to this day. So we look for clues. How do you make sense of nonsense? The nonsense is, of course, the spatial legacy of apartheid. The day-to-day democracy of the city is this ability to access the system. If we don't do that, we're not getting the job done. And when we run to 30 million people, we're talking about serious trouble if we don't get this right. So it's not a nice to have. So if we start looking for clues, we find sort of 10 to 12 kilometers around Joburg, there's this inner city of, this inner ring of satellites. And you'll find the same, it's an older city but less mature because its primary function was servicing an agricultural hinterland, but Pretoria has pretty much the same kind of pattern. And then very weakly one can determine the same sort of thing. Off the slide there, funnily enough, is Sasolburg on the other side of the Vaal River that sits in the same logic. But then if we go 20 to 25 kilometers out, you find another kind of urban center. It's a more real town, less of a satellite. It's got more of an urban profile. It's got industrial base. It's got all kinds of other things that make it more messy in many respects, but more real in other respects. And so we see that around Johannesburg. We see that around Pretoria, and we see that around, and even Parys now emerges on the radar around Vanderbijl Park there. Okay, so here's what we've got. We've got something that we can sort of find some sense, because interestingly, these outer loops, of course, actually touch those areas of displaced poverty. So what do? If we own Gauteng, we really push those cores very hard with policy support. We intensify the cruciform nature of it with public transport. We work out the logic that goes, too much of the apartheid city was this one-to-one relationship between dormitory labor camps, effectively, and industrial areas. We've got to break that and look at how public transport links these things in a circumferential way as well. And then we've got to work out how every single project we do must somehow say, how do we redress this marginalization and pull it back into the system? And so how do we sweat all the stuff that's already there? How do we make that strong, intense, cruciform system? How do we create a polynucleated city? And then we've got, of course, the Dolomites, which give us this heaven-sent kind of green belt around the whole lot. Because with 30 million people, we're going to need a lot of fertility, recreation, and to solve our aquifers, etc.